The heavy brass keycard felt like a block of ice in my palm. I stood in the lobby of the Silver Pine Lodge, a boutique hotel I had actually spent 3 years of my life designing, and listened to the concierge explain the amenities of a standard guest room. Just 2 hours earlier, I had arrived at my parents' sprawling mountain cabin for our traditional holiday week, only to find my brother Emmett's car in the driveway. And parked right behind it was the sleek black SUV belonging to Elena. Elena was my former business partner, my former fiancée, and currently the lead developer on the valley's largest commercial expansion. She was also the reason my father had met me on the porch of the cabin, handed me a prepaid hotel reservation, and quietly suggested that I stay in town for the week. He had adjusted the collar of his expensive wool coat, refusing to meet my eyes, and muttered that it was just for a few days. Emmett and Elena were closing a massive round of investor funding for the new ski resort, he had said. They needed the cabin to host the venture capitalists. Having the estranged, bought-out ex-partner brooding in the corner would be bad optics. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my bags into the snow. I simply took the reservation, got back into my truck, and drove down the mountain to the hotel. It was a strange, hollow kind of humiliation. To be excised from your own family's holiday so that the woman who dismantled your life could comfortably sip hot cider by your childhood fireplace. The hotel room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the main street of the town. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. For the past 18 months, I had been trying to rebuild my architectural firm in the city, far away from this valley. When Elena and I separated, it wasn't just a romantic collapse. We had co-founded a development firm to build sustainable mountain properties. When the relationship soured, she convinced my brother Emmett, a man who lived and breathed private equity, to buy out my shares. Emmett convinced our father to back the buyout. I was handed a check that barely covered my initial investment and was politely shown the door. I had spent the last year and a half convincing myself that the clean break was worth the financial loss. I walked over to the small desk in the corner of the room. There was a leather-bound welcome folder resting next to the lamp. I flipped it open, absent-mindedly scanning the welcome letter from the hotel management. The Silver Pine Lodge had been recently acquired by a new holding company, expanding its footprint. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the page, where the corporate ownership was listed in fine print. It read, "Operated by Apex Alpine Holdings, LLC." I stared at the letters. Apex Alpine Holdings was the original shell company Elena and I had formed 4 years ago when we first drafted the business plan for the valley. When Emmett engineered the buyout, part of the agreement was that my name would be scrubbed from all corporate entities, releasing me from any future liabilities or profits. Emmett had assured me the paperwork was filed. I had signed the dissolution forms in his lawyer's office. Seeing the name printed on the hotel stationery sent a slow, crawling sensation up the back of my neck. It could have been an oversight. The hotel might just be using old stationery. But my architectural brain, trained to look for structural flaws, wouldn't let it go. I pulled my laptop from my bag and connected to the hotel Wi-Fi. I accessed the state's corporate registry and searched for Apex Alpine Holdings. The page loaded, displaying the most recent annual report filed just 2 weeks ago. The active managing members were listed as Emmett Lowell and Elena Mercer. But underneath, in the section detailing the guarantor structure for the company's commercial credit lines, my name was still sitting there. Fletcher Lowell. I closed my laptop. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the heating vent. If my name was still on the guarantor list, I was legally exposed to whatever debt Emmett and Elena were leveraging to build their new resort. And knowing my brother's appetite for risk, that debt would be astronomical. The next morning, the town was covered in a fresh layer of bright, blinding snow. The holiday tourists were crowding the sidewalks, carrying skis and shopping bags. I walked 3 blocks down the street to the local branch of the regional commercial bank that handled most of the valley's large-scale development loans. The branch was quiet. I asked the teller to speak with a commercial loan officer regarding an existing corporate account. After a few minutes, I was guided into a frosted glass office. A man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a neat grey beard stood up from his desk. His nameplate read Aaron. I introduced myself and explained the situation. I told him I needed to verify that my name had been properly removed from the guarantor files for Apex Alpine Holdings, as per a buyout agreement signed 18 months ago. I handed him my identification and a digital copy of the dissolution agreement on my phone. Aaron adjusted his glasses and typed away at his keyboard for a long time. The clicking echoed in the small office. His brow furrowed. He clicked a few more times, pulled up a different screen, and then slowly leaned back in his leather chair. He looked at the screen, then at my ID, and then up at me. The bank manager said one sentence that changed everything. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mr. Lowell, we cannot process a release of liability today because according to the restructuring documents filed last Tuesday, you are the sole guarantor holding the $7 million default risk for the new resort development." The air in the room seemed to thin out. I gripped the armrests of the guest chair. I asked him to explain exactly what he was looking at. Aaron turned his monitor slightly so I could see the cascading lines of financial data. He explained that Apex Alpine Holdings had indeed been restructured. Emmett and Elena had created a new parent company for the resort, shielding their own assets. But instead of closing the original credit line that I had co-signed years ago, they had kept it open. More than that, they had used a loophole in our original poorly drafted operating agreement to transfer the toxic debt of the new resort's land acquisition down into Apex Alpine Holdings. Because my name had never been officially removed from the bank's internal guarantor registry, an oversight Emmett had deliberately failed to correct, I was on the hook if the resort failed. They weren't just pushing me out of the family business. They were using my financial ghost as a human shield for their venture capital pitch. When they hosted those investors at my parents' cabin this week, they would be showing clean personal balance sheets, having hidden all the foundational debt under my name. I asked Aaron how this was possible without my physical signature on the new loan disbursements. He pulled up a scanned document. It was a digital authorization form routed through an old company email address I hadn't used in 2 years. Someone had accessed the account and approved the transfer of liability. The IP address on the authorization log matched the corporate office Emmett and Elena shared. I didn't feel anger right away. I felt a cold, surgical clarity. For years, my family had treated me as the sensitive, impractical artist who didn't understand the real world of money and leverage. My father had constantly praised Emmett's ruthless efficiency. Now, that ruthlessness had crossed the line into wire fraud. I asked Aaron what my options were as the named guarantor. He looked uncomfortable but answered professionally. He explained that since I was listed as the sole remaining guarantor of that specific credit tier, I had the authority to freeze the line of credit pending a formal audit of the loan terms, especially if I was formally claiming the digital signature was fraudulent. I told him to freeze it. Aaron warned me that doing so would immediately halt all outgoing payments from Apex Alpine Holdings. It would flag the parent company's accounts, any checks they had written to contractors, any escrow deposits for land purchases, and any financial proofs required for pending investor agreements would instantly bounce or show as compromised. I took a slow breath and nodded. I signed the fraud dispute forms. I watched Aaron type the commands into his terminal. With a final keystroke, a red banner appeared across the account profile on his screen. The financial lifeblood of Emmett and Elena's Grand Mountain Resort was completely stopped. I thanked Aaron, took my copies of the dispute forms, and walked out of the bank. The cold mountain air felt incredibly sharp in my lungs. It was 2 in the afternoon. The investor dinner at the family cabin was scheduled for 7. I went back to the hotel, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window. I watched the snow fall. I didn't call my parents. I didn't text my brother. I simply waited. At 4:30, my phone began to ring. The caller ID showed Emmett's name. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, it rang again. This time it was Elena. I silenced the device and placed it face down on the desk. Over the next hour, the phone vibrated almost continuously. Text messages began to pile up on the lock screen. They started as confused questions, escalated into irritated demands, and finally devolved into absolute panic. Emmett's messages were frantic. He was asking if I had spoken to the bank. He was demanding I call him immediately. He said there was a misunderstanding with the accounts that was going to ruin the dinner with the venture capitalists. At 6 o'clock, I put on my coat and left the hotel. I drove my truck up the winding mountain road toward my parents' cabin. The sun had set, and the trees cast long, dark shadows across the snow. When I pulled into the driveway, the scene was chaotic. The catering van was idling near the garage. The sleek black SUV was still there, but Emmett was pacing on the front porch in the freezing cold, holding his phone to his ear. When he saw my truck, he practically ran down the stairs. His face was pale, his eyes wide and panicked. He didn't bother with a greeting. He just grabbed the door handle of my truck as I stepped out. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The bank just sent an automated notice to the investor's escrow agent. They froze everything. The whole deal is dead in the water if we don't show liquidity by tomorrow morning. I closed the truck door calmly. I went to the bank to get my name off the old Apex account, Emmett, just like you promised you did 18 months ago. Elena stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a stunning dark green evening dress, clearly ready to play the successful, charming hostess. But her composure was entirely gone. Her jaw was tight, and she was glaring at me with a mixture of fear and fury. My father walked out behind her. He looked confused and annoyed. "Fletcher," he said, his tone carrying that familiar, condescending edge. "What is going on? Emmett says you're sabotaging the company. You were supposed to stay at the hotel." I walked past Emmett and stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at my father. "I'm not sabotaging anything, Dad. I'm just protecting myself from federal fraud charges." My father stopped. The annoyance on his face shifted into genuine confusion. "Fraud? What are you talking about?" I pulled the folded copies of the bank documents from my coat pocket. I held them out, not to Emmett but to my father. "I suggest you read these before you serve dinner to your investors. Emmett and Elena didn't just buy me out. They kept my name on the guarantor files and dumped $7 million of toxic acquisition debt onto my profile to keep their own credit clean for the venture capitalists. Someone accessed an old email account and forged my digital authorization to do it. The silence that fell over the driveway was absolute. The only sound was the low hum of the catering van's engine. My father slowly reached out and took the papers. He unfolded them. He wasn't a banker, but he had spent his life in corporate management. He knew how to read a liability ledger. I watched his eyes scan the lines. I watched him see my name sitting alone under the column marked Default Guarantor. He looked up, staring at Emmett. "Is this true?" he asked. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Did you leverage this new project against your brother's name?" Emmett stammered. He looked at Elena for help, but she had taken a step back. Her arms crossed tight against the cold, her eyes darting away. "Dad, it was just a temporary bridge," Emmett pleaded. "We were going to refinance the whole structure next quarter after the venture capital cleared. It was just a paperwork shortcut to keep the debt-to-income ratio clean for tonight. Nobody was going to get hurt." "You forged his authorization," my father said, the reality of the legal exposure dawning on him. Eleanor finally spoke up, her voice sharp and defensive. "We didn't forge anything. The operating agreement gave managing partners the right to execute routine financial transfers. It was a gray area, not fraud. It stopped being a gray area when you tried to hide $7 million of liability on someone you kicked out of the company," I said, looking directly at her. "And it stopped being a gray area when I signed the dispute forms at the bank this afternoon." My father lowered the papers. He looked older in that moment, the polished facade of the successful patriarch cracking under the weight of his favorite son's deception. He looked at the cabin, where the catered food was waiting, where the investors would be arriving in less than an hour. Then he looked at Emmett. "You need to call the investors," my father said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "What?" Emmett asked, panicking. "Dad, no. If we cancel tonight, they pull out. We lose the Valley parcels. We lose everything." "You've already lost it," my father replied. "If you go in there and take their money with frozen accounts and a pending fraud dispute on your primary holding company, you won't just go bankrupt, you will go to prison. Call them. Tell them there is an internal accounting crisis and the dinner is cancelled." Emmett stared at him, devastated. Eleanor turned around without saying a word and walked back into the cabin, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind her. I stood in the snow, and watch the empire they had built on my back crumble in the space of 3 minutes. There was no screaming match. There was no dramatic fist fight. There was just the cold, hard reality of consequence. I didn't stay to watch them make the phone calls. I turned around and walked back to my truck. My father called my name as I opened the door. I paused and looked back at him. He stood on the porch, holding the evidence of his favored son's betrayal, looking completely lost. "I'm sorry, Fletcher," he said quietly. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know they did this." "I believe you," I said. I got into the truck and started the engine. I drove back down the mountain to the hotel. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel a sudden rush of joy. But as I walked into the lobby of the Silver Pine Lodge, the building I had designed, I felt lighter. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of trying to prove my worth to people who fundamentally did not respect me was gone. The next morning, I packed my bag and checked out. The local news was already running a small segment on the sudden collapse of the valley's biggest real estate deal. The venture capitalists had pulled out overnight after the escrow freeze. Emmett and Elena were facing a massive audit, and their professional reputations in the region were completely destroyed. I drove out of the snowy valley, heading back toward the city. The radio played softly in the background. I watched the mountain peaks fade in the rearview mirror, knowing I would never return to this place. I had lost a business, and in many ways, I had lost a family. But as the highway opened up in front of me, clear and dry, I knew I had finally secured the one thing they couldn't take away. My future was entirely my own. The highway out of the valley was supposed to be my clean break, but the illusion of a quiet exit shattered before I even reached the city limits. My phone, resting on the passenger seat, began to vibrate with a rapid succession of notifications. I ignored them at first, assuming it was just more of Emmett's frantic backpedaling or my father's delayed attempts at reconciliation. But when the caller ID flashed with the direct line of Aaron, the bank manager from the Silver Pine branch, the quiet sense of victory I had felt leaving the mountain evaporated. I pulled onto the shoulder of the highway, the gravel crunching under my tires, and answered the call. Aaron's voice was remarkably strained, stripped of the calm, bureaucratic detachment he had maintained the day before. He informed me that first thing that morning, Emmett and Elena's corporate attorney had walked into the bank with a formal injunction to unfreeze the Apex Alpine Holdings accounts. They weren't just claiming a misunderstanding anymore. They had produced a physical, notarized document dated 2 weeks before our buyout agreement, explicitly detailing my consent to absorb the resort's land acquisition debt. According to Aaron, the signature looked flawless, and the notary stamp was legitimate. The bank's legal department was now forcing him to lift the freeze within 48 hours, unless I could provide irrefutable proof that the physical document was a forgery. I sat in the freezing truck, listening to the roar of passing traffic. Elena had always been meticulous, always preparing a contingency plan. When the digital authorization I had flagged was proven insufficient, she simply escalated to a physical forgery she had likely kept in a drawer for this exact scenario. She knew that in a battle of he said, she said over a notarized document, the bank would default to the paper trail to avoid liability, effectively handing the $7 million of toxic debt right back to me. I thanked Aaron for the warning and immediately called the only person I knew who could navigate this kind of corporate warfare. Diana was a former colleague from my early days in architecture, someone who had transitioned into construction law after getting tired of watching developers exploit designers. When I reached her office in the city, I laid out the entire timeline. I explained the buyout, the digital loophole, the frozen account, and now the miraculously appearing notarized document. Diana listened in silence, tapping a gold pen against her legal pad. When I finished, she didn't offer empty reassurances. She told me exactly how precarious my situation was. A notary stamp carried immense legal weight. If Emmett and Elena had found a corrupt notary, or if they had somehow managed to steal a notary's seal, proving the document was fake, would require a forensic audit that could take months. By that time, the investors would be gone, the resort would collapse, and the bank would aggressively liquidate my current firm's assets to cover the default on the $7 million loan. They were trying to bleed me out before the truth could catch up to them. Diana asked me for the exact date printed on the forged document. I pulled up the scan Aaron had securely emailed me while I was driving. It was dated October 14th of the previous year. I stared at the date, a strange, creeping sensation working its way through my memory. October 14th. I closed my eyes and mentally walked back through the timeline of the buyout. That was the week everything had fallen apart between Elena and me. It was the week she had first approached Emmett with her plan to push me out. But more importantly, it was the week I had practically lived at the municipal zoning office, desperately trying to salvage our permits for a different project. I opened my eyes and looked at Diana. I wasn't in the office on October 14th, I told her, my voice steadying as the pieces began to align. I was 300 miles away, auditing a concrete pour on a commercial site in the neighboring state. I was there for 3 days. There is absolutely no physical way I could have sat in front of a notary in our home office to sign that liability transfer. Diana's posture shifted. She stopped tapping the pen. If you can prove you were out of state on the exact date that document was allegedly notarized, the forgery becomes an open and shut case of federal fraud, she said. The notary loses their license and goes to jail, and your brother and your ex-fiancé face immediate indictment. But we need hard proof. Plane tickets, hotel receipts, GPS logs, something they can't dispute. I drove back to my apartment and tore through my home office. I dug into the physical archives I had hauled away when Emmett bought me out. I found the travel folder from that month. I had the hotel receipt and a rental car agreement, but as I reviewed them, my stomach dropped. The hotel was booked under the company's corporate card, which Elena controlled. The rental car had been secured through Emmett's logistics account. Both of them could easily claim in court that I had booked the travel but never actually went, or that I had returned early. I needed something that placed me on that construction site in person at the exact time the document was supposedly signed. I spent the next 12 hours combing through old emails, project management software, and server backups. I was looking for time-stamped photographs, site logs, anything that proved my physical presence, but Elena had been thorough. During the buyout, she had wiped my access to the central servers, deleting my digital footprint from the company's active history. The site logs from that specific week were gone. It was past midnight when I finally stopped staring at the glowing screen. I walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water, exhausted and cornered. My mind kept drifting back to the concrete pour. It was a massive foundation for a subterranean parking structure. I had been arguing with the site foreman about the curing temperature. I remembered the heavy rain, the mud, the specific smell of the chemical sealant. And then I remembered the municipal inspector. Every major concrete pour required a city inspector to be present to sign off on the structural integrity before the next phase could begin. The inspector didn't work for our company. He worked for the state, and state inspectors didn't use our internal software. They filed their own independent reports into the county database, complete with timestamps, photographs, and the required signatures of the lead architect on site. I abandoned the water glass and rushed back to my computer. I bypassed our old corporate servers completely and logged into the state's open-access construction portal. I navigated to the county where the pour had taken place, filtering the public records by date and project parcel. The system was ancient, slow, and endlessly frustrating, loading each page with agonizing hesitation. Finally, the October 14th folder appeared. I clicked on the structural sign-off document. A PDF loaded onto my screen. It was the official municipal inspection report. There at the bottom of the page, time-stamped at 2:15 in the afternoon, the exact hour the notary claimed I was sitting in my brother's office 300 miles away, was a high-resolution photograph taken by the city inspector. It showed the foundation grid, the pouring crew, and standing in the foreground wearing a hard hat and holding the blueprints was me. Right next to the photo was my physical signature, countersigned by the state official, legally binding my presence at that site. I printed the document, the printer churning loudly in the quiet apartment. I didn't just have an alibi. I had a state-certified, publicly archived, irrefutable piece of evidence that proved Emmett and Eleanor had manufactured a fraudulent legal document to steal $7 million. I didn't sleep. At 6 in the morning, I scanned the state report and sent it to Diana with a single sentence: file the injunction. At 9 o'clock, I walked into Diana's office. She was already on the phone, her voice a sharp, commanding instrument. She hung up and looked at me, a fierce, satisfied smile crossing her face. She had just spoken to the bank's legal department and presented the municipal report. The bank had not only reinstated the freeze on the accounts, but they had also officially flagged the notarized document for internal fraud review. But Diana wasn't finished. She handed me a fresh stack of papers. "While you were digging up your alibi, I did some digging of my own," she said. "I wanted to know who this notary was. Why would a licensed professional risk federal prison to help your brother fake a signature?" I looked at the paperwork. It was a background check on the notary whose stamp was on the forged document. The notary wasn't some random associate. Her name was Sarah Mercer, Elena's younger sister. The audacity of it was staggering. Elena hadn't just manipulated my family. She had weaponized her own. She had used her sister's legal credentials to execute the final blow, assuming I would be too intimidated by the legal threat to dig into the details. They thought I would simply fold, accept the debt, and let them build their empire on my ruins. "We don't just go to the bank with this," Diana said, leaning across her desk. "We go to the district attorney. Using a family member to forge a financial guarantee of this magnitude elevates this from a civil dispute to criminal conspiracy." I looked down at the name on the paper. For a moment, the memory of the holidays we used to spend together flashed in my mind. I remembered Elena's family, the dinners, the shared laughter. It all felt like a bizarre, distant movie now, replaced by the cold reality of signatures, ledgers, and federal crimes. "Do it," I said. "Draft the criminal complaint." By noon, the legal machinery was moving faster than I could have anticipated. Diana had coordinated with the district attorney's office, presenting the forged document alongside the state inspection report and the proof of the notary's familial connection to the primary beneficiary of the fraud. Warrants were being drafted. I left Diana's office and walked out into the city streets. The cold wind felt entirely different today. It wasn't the bitter, biting cold of the mountain. It was sharp and clarifying. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was my father. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. His voice sounded hollow, stripped of the booming authority that had defined my entire life. "Fletcher," he said, his breathing shallow. "The police are at the corporate office. They're taking Emmett's computers. They're looking for Elena." I stood on the crowded sidewalk, watching the city move around me. I didn't feel a rush of vengeance. I didn't feel joy. I just felt the heavy, undeniable weight of a consequence that had been a long time coming. "What did you do, Fletcher?" my father whispered into the phone, the sound of breaking glass echoing faintly in the background of his end of the line. "I didn't do anything, Dad," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I just showed them the paperwork." I didn't wait for my father to process my answer. I simply ended the call and slid the phone back into my pocket. The ambient noise of the city street rushed in to fill the silence, the sound of traffic and hurried footsteps grounding me in the present moment. For years, I had craved my father's validation, constantly twisting my own ambitions to fit the rigid shape of his expectations. But standing on the pavement, knowing that investigators were currently boxing up the fraudulent empire he had so proudly endorsed, I realized the desperate need for his approval was completely gone. The collapse of Apex Alpine Holdings was methodical, absolute, and entirely public. Diana handled my legal severance with a surgical, brutal efficiency. Once the district attorney's office brought Sarah Mercer in for questioning, the forged notary stamp unraveled the entire conspiracy. Facing the reality of federal prison for utilizing her state license to facilitate a multi-million-dollar fraud, Eleanor's sister immediately secured a plea deal. She handed over encrypted text messages proving that Eleanor had explicitly orchestrated the forgery, and more damningly, that Emmett had fully authorized the submission of the fake document to the commercial bank. The immediate fallout was catastrophic for them. The venture capital firm didn't just pull their funding, they filed a massive civil suit for misrepresentation. The commercial bank aggressively foreclosed on the Valley land parcels, forcing the holding company into immediate, unrecoverable liquidation. My father tried to salvage the wreckage, of course. He attempted to leverage his personal retirement assets to bail Emmett out of the initial civil judgments. but the sheer scale of the $7 million default swallowed his remaining liquidity whole. 3 weeks after the police raid on the corporate office, my father requested a meeting. We sat across from each other in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at Diana's firm. He looked fundamentally aged. The polished, commanding patriarch who had met me on the porch of the cabin was gone, replaced by a tired man in a rumpled suit. He asked me to formally withdraw my civil damages claim, arguing that the criminal indictments were punishment enough and the family was already financially ruined. He looked down at his hands, his voice lacking its usual thunder, and suggested that we needed to stick together to survive the scandal. I looked at the man who had casually handed me a prepaid hotel reservation so I wouldn't ruin a dinner party with the woman who stole my company. I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level, that the state was prosecuting the criminal fraud, not me. My civil suit was the only legal barrier protecting my current firm from being absorbed by their collateral damage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand an apology for the years of subtle humiliation. I simply slid the settlement waiver he had brought back across the polished table, entirely unsigned. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and walked out of the room. That was the last time we spoke. 7 months passed. The heavy snow finally melted in the mountain valley, and the massive parcels of land Emmett had tried to develop were quietly auctioned off by the regional bank to a conservation trust. I never checked to see how much they sold for. My life was no longer tied to that mountain or to the shadows of the people who lived there. My architectural firm in the city began to thrive. Without the constant draining gravity of my family's drama pulling me backward, I poured my focus into my work. We secured a major municipal contract to design a series of sustainable, integrated community centers for the city's outer districts. It wasn't a glamorous, high-society luxury ski resort built on leveraged debt. It was grounded, functional, and deeply real. It was late on a Thursday evening in October, exactly 1 year after the forged document had been falsely dated. The office was quiet, the rest of my team having gone home hours ago. The drafting lamps cast warm, steady circles of light across the wide wooden desks. I stood by the expansive windows, looking out at the city skyline, listening to the soft hum of the ventilation system. On the corner of my desk rested the heavy brass keycard from the Silver Pine Lodge. The hotel management had never asked for it back after the chaotic morning I checked out, and it had lingered in the bottom of my duffel bag for months before finding its way to my office. I picked it up, feeling the familiar freezing weight of the metal against my palm. I held it for a long moment, letting the memory of that humiliating night wash over me one final time, stripped of all its original sting. I walked over to the recycling bin, opened my hand and let the brass key fall. It hit the bottom with a dull, final thud. I walked back to my desk, sat down in the quiet light, unrolled a fresh sheet of drafting paper, and picked up my pencil to begin drawing a completely new foundation.